I think it's clear that historic tax credits are a vital economic development tool for upstate New York. But really, it's not just the total investment made in these projects that's so compelling. It's truthfully that any of these projects or some of these projects are happening at all. These are perennially difficult to develop projects. This is what we call a but-for program. In other words, but for the rehab tax credit program, Harmony Mills in Cohoes would still be a vacant shell. And you could probably say the same thing about the Sibley department store building in Rochester. You could say the same thing about the Randolph houses in Harlem, Hotel Syracuse, the DeWitt Clinton Hotel in Albany, all projects that would not have happened when they happened without using this important program.
My involvement in this issue goes back to 2009. We had a federal historic rehabilitation tax credit on the books for a number of years. There was no state matching program at that time. We were able to create it in state law back in 2009 and then extend it when it was set to expire a few years later. We're at that critical point in time once again. And as Jay indicated, $6 billion worth of projects in the pipeline. That's a lot of projects, and that's building off a lot of success over the last 8 years. We often, in the economic development world, you hear the term tools in the toolbox. And many of you and other preservationists and developers across the state have certainly told me and my colleagues in the legislature that this is one of the most important tools in that economic development toolbox. It's something that we know that works. There's no question about that. And we are at that critical point in time to keep very important momentum moving forward. The extension, even though it doesn't expire, as Jay indicated, for a little less than 2 years, now is the time that developers look to the climate moving forward. So having this program renewed for another 5 years as part of this budget process, that's our immediate priority. To get the tax credit renewed as part of this session's budget process. And then number two, as a result of the changes in federal tax law, it's critically important to decouple the two programs, the federal program and the state program, which have the state program has in effect piggybacked on the federal program. We need to change that course of action moving forward. If we're able to accomplish both of those things, and they're summarized in Senate Bill 7648, if we can be successful there, we most certainly can continue the tremendous redevelopment of so many of these historic properties all across New York State. So I'm looking forward to continuing to work very closely with my colleagues in both the Senate and the Assembly, as well as with the governor and under his leadership, seeing that we get this accomplished this year and in this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I'd like to ask our chair of our sponsor of A 9882, Assembly Member Carrie Woerner, to step forward to say a few words. Carrie.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My Senate colleague summarized for you what the bills in the Senate and the Assembly are intended to do. I represent Saratoga County and Washington County, and in a very real way, Saratoga Springs, which is a jewel in upstate and is really a highlight of our upstate economy, is the city that preservation built. There are so many projects in Saratoga Springs that would not have happened if there were not both federal and state tax credits. And I know some of you are local and you may have stopped in to see the rehabilitation of the Adelphi. This was a $30 million rehab project that saved the last great hotel in Saratoga Springs. And that project would not have happened but for the state tax credits. So this is a project to extend the program that is really near and dear to my heart and I think to many upstate communities that have experienced the investment and the economic activity that comes from the reinvestment in our communities that this tax credit program has created. So I am pleased to be able to sponsor it in the Assembly and to work with my colleagues both in the Assembly and the Senate to continue this economic development program for upstate New York. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Jay, and it's a pleasure to join with all my colleagues. As you can tell, when it comes to economic development, when it comes to historic preservation, it's a bipartisan thing, isn't it? It's a bipartisan effort. I could speak just to my own experience as mayor of the city of Cohoes, where 700,000 square feet of a forgotten mills have been reclaimed and remade into beautiful loft housing on the rivers in our community of Cohoes. But when I think about just my district alone, Watervliet to Tilly lofts, in Troy the Redbird building, yes, the Harmony Mills lofts, here in Albany the warehouse district, easily you can count 1.5 million square feet of basically forgotten properties that have been reclaimed and rebirthed. And this is the beauty of the historic tax credit. In Cohoes, in 2001, Uri Kaufman jumped into my office, said, we're going to try to do something with this building. And 11 years later, we finally found success. The reason I mention 11 years is these projects don't happen overnight. They take time, they take commitment, they need resources, and from a developer's point of view, they need surety. They need to make sure that the program is going to be around when they finally finish the project. This bill accomplishes that and makes sure that the proper resources are in place in a timely manner to make it successful. And as one who represents urban areas, areas that are pretty much built out when it comes to tax base, this by far is one of the most important economic development tools that benefits the taxpayers. Thank you.
We also have with us. Sure, yeah. I mean, there's a few important things to think about when you think about tax credits, particularly the historic rehab tax credit. First of all, one of the beauties of the historic tax credit is the project needs to be completed before the tax credits are paid. So we're not in a situation with this program where there's grants made and promises made and things happen that aren't kept. This is a program that is really comes in on the tail end of the revitalization that happens. Secondly, I'd say that it's really been the overwhelming response of research that these tax credits spin off more than it costs the state or the federal government to get it done. And so they generate more revenue on the tail end, creating those jobs, revitalizing the neighborhoods, et cetera. And one of the important things to think about too is, this, as I said in my comments, is a building by building type of economic development incentive. And that's kind of the hard way to do it. People like to come in and pour a whole bunch of money into a big, huge project, but really when you use historic preservation as a way to do this, it has this amazing trickle-down impact. And when you redo one of these buildings in one of these communities, you start to see all the other neighbors doing the same thing, often without using any grants or without using any tax credits. So it really has this wonderful multiplier effect on communities.
And also, it sounds like it's almost like a terrible indictment on the real estate investors or developers that they won't do this without the tax credit?
Well, I think we have to remember that they're not going to do these projects at a loss. And despite the way that upstate New York's economy has turned around, really what we're able to charge probably for square foot of property now is the same amount we were able to charge 10 or 15 years ago. And so we're not able to generate a whole lot of great additional revenue when we redo these projects, but the costs have continued to climb. And so often what you see with these historic preservation projects is really this layering of financing that gets the projects done. So you'll have maybe state grants, you'll have private equity, you'll have preservation tax credits, maybe you have brownfield tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, and it's this whole layering effect that has to happen in order to get these projects done, because otherwise they just wouldn't. And we saw this when we didn't have a state rehab tax credit program. So we had a federal program, but all the federal tax credits were being used downstate. Once we get that state tax credit program, then suddenly we've been able to tip a bunch of those projects that were on the fence upstate to being done. And then we're able to get all of those federal tax dollars flowing back into New York State. Remember, when you use the state tax credit in New York, what you're really doing is you're leveraging that to get additional federal tax credit dollars. So we've seen this great increase of federal dollars flowing back into New York State for these projects that we just didn't have before.